Anbennar is a D&D inspired, but not entirely D&D based, noble dark fantasy setting created by J. Bean and takes place in the world of Anbennar, an elven word in universe meaning communion. Most people know Anbennar as the wildly popular EU4 mod and its sort of early modern era meets fantasy setting. This video will focus on elements of that mod, of course, considering they're the same world, but with the upcoming CK3 version in mind, this is going to be a much more medieval fantasy type setting. The CK3 release looks to initially narrow the playable scope and takes players to 1022 AA, or After Ash, which is just after the War of the Sorcerer King of Black Castanor, and 22 years post-elf arrival on the continent of Canor. This contrasts with the EU start of 1444 After Ash, so this is about 422 years prior to the EU4 mod, and allows players to play as major canon characters like the very first half-elven king Marion Silmuna or Jahir, the chosen of Suriel and leader of the Sun Elves. The CK3 mod will also focus largely on the continent of Canor, with parts of Bulwar and Godherja also planned for the CK3 1.0 release, but as I understand it, most things east of the Serpent Spine, this mountain range right here, are not in work at the moment. This video aims to not only highlight the world and its lore, but get the CK3 community interested in the mod itself. It is very early in development, so if you're interested in modding and would like to contribute, I highly recommend checking out the CK3 development section of their Discord. With this in mind, also note that any characters or locations seen on screen are likewise subject to change, so if your game looks different than this earlier development version, that's why. With that out of the way, like many fantasy settings, Anbennar has numerous fantastical races, most of which you've likely heard of, such as humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, gnomes, and orcs, but also a few lesser used races like half-elves, half-orcs, kobolds, gnolls, and harpies dotting its landscape. I will discuss relevant information about the races as they come up in the timeline if necessary, but most of it is probably already familiar to you, like some dwarves being on the surface and some below, or orcs being tribal in nature. Therefore, I will not redundantly explain what a human, gnome, halfling, and so on are, because you probably already know, unless they have a major difference between this and other fantasy works, or if it's a race that is sort of unique to Anbennar. Don't expect to hear much about them in this video. Now keep in mind that most of these races are not present quite yet in the game, the most exotic one being the kobolds, but I will use visual aids to discuss the ones that are absent. Now prior to the CK3 mod start, there is a pretty significant timeline of events, and the main purpose of this video will be to lay out said timeline for you so that you have the context necessary to enjoy the mod. I drew this information from the Anbennar wiki, as well as the Discord, and had two of the main devs for the CK3 version, Enceladus and Adraxia, look over the script for error, so hopefully I didn't mess anything up from here. But I think this is enough of a preamble, so therefore without further ado, I'm Sol, and this is Anbennar. Known lore essentially begins in the year 2000 BA or before Ash, with the founding of the human civilizations of Old Godherja, Bulwar, and Rahen, in the region players can see near the bottom of the CK3 map. You can look at this as Anbennar's Mesopotamia if you like. In the year 1200 BA, a mysterious race of aquatic beings known as Deep Devils came from the sea and attacked the regions of Bulwar, Godherja, Fengaula, and other regions across the Divenhall coast. This is just below the Dame's Head, by the way, the Dame's Head being this sea right here. This event is now known as the Onslaught, which devastated the region and gave rise to non-human civilizations in the area, such as harpies who came down from their mountains and hills to claim the lowlands, and gnolls who would settle around Bulwar and Godherja starting around 1152 BA behind their leader Kra, the first slave master, who sold humans cheap to the nearby ruined cities and came from the gnolls' ancestral homeland of Sarhal. Godherja was notably one of the few cities to survive these aquatic-based attacks, which is interesting. Now for those unfamiliar, harpies are an avian female race led by a matriarch, who often kidnap or coerce other races, though mostly humans, to reproduce and often take on the facial features of that race upon hatching. They share a similar, if not slightly longer, lifespan to humans. Gnolls, which you may be a little more familiar with if you've ever played the Warcraft series, are a bestial and carnivorous race who tower over normal men with an average height of just under 7 feet and bear a striking resemblance to bipedal hyenas. Gnolls are often employed as mercenaries or slave masters and are a fearsome foe. They live for usually about 30 to 40 years, although this could potentially be due to their violent lifestyle and not their genetic ability. In 1127 BA, the gnomish hierarchy consisting of gnome and halfling peoples rose in Canor and were the first of the three great empires to rise in the coming age of Antiquity. Initially a coalition of city-states, the gnomes were united by the residents of Roivabab, a fort used to secure the borders on the eastern side of their established lands. But the gnomes and the halflings of Roivabab were cunning, and when a group of marauding humans and other beings came towards the city-states, they found the gates wide open as had been planned, and the land was ravaged. With the city-states in disarray and their armies destroyed, Roivabab annexed their lands to form the gnomish hierarchy, and promptly put the raiders who they previously promised the spoils and riches of their pillage to death. The gnomish hierarchy would reign for nearly 1600 years, and were a major center of trade in the ancient world. Their founding marks the relative end of the Age of Awakening and begins what we know now as the Age of Antiquity. So in 993 BA, rising Nolish powers begin claiming small kingdoms for themselves. These are petty slave kingdoms in Sarhal, giving rise to an age of oppression in that region. Nols are then united into the Nol Great Zaz by the first Zazobin, which was a powerful Nolish warrior empowered by a Zazob, which is a kind of demon and unifier of the Nolish people in 654 BA. Nols begin worshipping demons as a result of her reign, and she's also going to be playing a pretty significant role in another kingdom's history very soon. This conquest by the Zaz happens in the same time as a large contingency of slaves known as the Proto-Castanites begin fleeing from Keterata and Bulwar and migrating north into Canor following the Great Sack of Keterat by the first Zazobin. Initially arriving in Bulwar, the slaves were faced with civil wars and unrest as Nolish armies ravaged the region. Fleeing northward with a horde of Nol Great Zar on their heels, they continued to gather followers, and by the time they reached Canor had a diverse and large force at their command. In 651 BA, under the leadership of a warrior named Humak, the Proto-Castanites had settled on a hill north of Bulwar and had lived for a time with the local people until the first Zazobin arrived, leading to the Battle of Burning Hill, where Humak was slain fighting the Zazobin with his son Castan praying for their god Castelos to intervene. All of a sudden a silver dragon appeared high in the sky, allowing the Castanites to flee into a region known as the Deep Woods. The humans settled north in Burning Hills and elected Castan as their leader, which he refused, and instead placed a council of elders in charge of their group. The elders then suggested the Proto-Castanites continue further into the Deep Woods, while the Nols regrouped. There they were lost for 10 years within the Fey realm of the Deep Woods, in what is known as the Lost Years. It is said as they wandered they occasionally saw the silver dragon flying high overhead, leading them north where they met one known as the Way Guide near Southmount, who some today speculate to be the silver dragon himself in human form. The Way Guide offered to take Castan to meet with the silver dragon atop of the North Twin, and for a year he and the Way Guide wandered the woods while his people waited, some losing hope he would ever return. But upon his return exactly 1 year later, Castan came alone with a proclamation.
Our newfound savior and god, Castelos, has chosen me as his divine champion, and will choose another in my name after my passing to lead our people. Henceforth all that have followed and endured with me shall be known as my people, Castanites. And our realm's successors will be of your blood, and your blood alone. Our divine duty has been revealed to protect the land from beastly acts, barbarism, and evil.
Castan notably would not comment or ever speak on what became of the Way Guide, but led his people out of the woods and thus ended the Lost Years. In 639 BA, the newly minted Castanites emerged from the Deep Woods and settled along the Nath River in Iskan, where they founded the city of Castanath. And thus the Empire of Castan, one of the greatest human empires in history, and second great empire of Antiquity, was born under the leadership of their new emperor, or Castan as the title is called, Castan I. In 636 BA, an exiled dwarf named Belegar the Builder arrived in Castanor. He would introduce dwarven words and phrases, customs, and currency to the empire, as well as create many of the early empire's great structures known as Belegar's Wonders, which include the Dragon Forge, the largest forge of the ancient world, and the white walls of Castanor, which you can not only see in this image, but on the map itself, which are massive white walls surrounding Inner Castanor and providing protection for migrating humans coming to the empire. He would later be deified by the Castanorians as god of crafts and construction. Surface dwarves notably also revere his spirit and memory. Since this is our first mention of the dwarves, they, like humans, are as you would expect them in a fantasy setting. Only in Anbennar there are not just a couple variants, but dozens, from stone to copper to obsidian and so on, based on basically where they're located. Some, likewise, like I said before, live on the surface and are less valued in their society below, like in Dragon Age, one of the inspirations for this mod. In general, though, they're the same bearded, industrious, stubborn, and fierce warriors you are probably familiar with, and live for around 200 years on average. 634 BA to 355 BA is what I'm going to call the Age of the Castans. This is going to be about various rulers now. Castan I begins a campaign of nullification of all bestial races within and near Castan's borders, shortly after the arrival of Belegar, from what I understand. This led to the death of Zazobin at the hands of Castan I, dividing their great empire in Sarhal in 634 BA, and led to the first great cleansing in 633 BA, which sees virtually all Nullkind in Canor wiped out. It was during such a campaign in 618 that Castan I disappeared, leading to a question of succession answered with the creation of the Trials of Castan, a series of challenges set on or around the Trial Mount, which claimants must overcome to be considered worthy of the office. The first successor was Castan II, Beastbane, who, as all who would follow him, added his own trial to the test, so that every ruler after would be better than the one preceding. These trials ranged from jumping around a rock 10 times to befriending a wyvern. Towards the end of the campaign and around the death of Castan I, the city of Damanoth, seat of the later Demirian Republic, is founded in the Dame's Head region. The Dame's Head, of course, being a sea named for its shape, which looks like a head of a dame. It was founded by exiles and runaways from Castanor and became a major trade hub with kingdoms to the south. It remained for a time a mostly independent colony of the Empire and was bolstered with the construction of the first of Castanor's great citadels, Balbertesk, which oversaw its protection. Castan II's rule, which lasted from 612 BA to 569 BA, is largely remembered for the White Walls of Castanor, which began construction in 612 BA shortly after his coronation. The Pantheonic Council, which established the initial pantheon of Castanorian gods to include the silver dragon Castalos in 600 BA, and the legal legitimization of the hunting and persecution of all bestial races within Canor to include harpies, satyrs, centaurs, and gnolls. This prompted the Second Great Cleansing in 596 BA, which drove nearly all beast races in Canor to near extinction and saw most of the deep woods burned down as a result. With Canor secured, Castan II sought to eliminate bestial folk for good in all lands and headed south into Bulwar and the Salahad Desert, where he eventually disappeared and no more was heard from him. But not before he freed Keterada from Gnollish rule and established a major alliance between them and Castanor. Not much of note between the royal line happens until Castan V, who was actually a direct descendant of Castan II, which is not common, as you know, considering that their succession is based on a series of acts, not on a series of primogeniture. Mostly known as Castan the Great, he ruled Castanor at its height in power and size and voted for independence of the colonies along the Dame's Head in 471 BA, so kind of a chill dude. He mostly expanded to the north, and as he did so, he would find the Hellenic peoples of the Great Wood, a fearsome and stoic folk who would prove a thorn for anyone who attempted to expand there. Though he is known as the Great, there's not actually a whole lot of information about Castan V, and he was succeeded by Castan VI, Giantsbane, who largely spent his rule fighting the Wars of the Giantsbane, which sparked when the last of the giants besieged Castanor around the 360s, 350s BA. These giants were defeated in 357 BA by the Castanorians of Giantsbane and the dwarves of various holds. Castan VI would also implement the first Castanorian coin, switching over from the old dwarven currency with the rise of the cult of Ara, which was the goddess of trade and coin in their realm. In 315 BA, a collection of ancient city-states along the Dame's Head coast vassalized by Castanor during the late 500s began rebelling in hopes of improving their status within Castanor. Feeling mistreated after harsh tax increases and the sharp centralization of Castanor in the century following the Giantsbane Wars. After two wars, the first fought between 315 and 312 BA, which saw them gain many privileges and proved Castanor could bleed, and the second between 308 and 300 BA, which with the aid of the Gnomish hierarchy earned them a second victory. The city-states formed the collective Demirian Republic, the last of the empires of antiquity. These three powers, the Gnomish hierarchy, Castanor, and the Demirian Republic, warred frequently with one another for control of the region in what would become known as the Wars of Dominion, of which there were 7, beginning in 350 BA. The last 100 years of this century, known as the Age of Antiquity, between 78 BA and about 69 BA, would see the Demirian Republic and Gnomish hierarchy dividing the lands of Lensinor and the small country, which is home of the Halflings, between themselves, forming a border along the Portroy River. This concludes the Age of Antiquity section and is now going to get into the Age of Ash, which is not our current age, but takes place just before and has a huge number of events that we're going to be talking about. The Day of Ashen Skies, or the Ruin of Elantir, is effectively year 1 on the modern Anbennar calendar, and was a cataclysmic worldwide event whose chief victim was the elf continent of Elantir, which was destroyed and forced the elves to flee, altering the course of history forever. The calamity is generally broken up into 5 stages, beginning with the final days of the Elven Civil War, known as the War of Two, between the Precursor Empire and Dukaniel and his followers. Dukaniel, having lost and been captured in the flying city of Asades, began preparing a dark magic ritual, stating that if he could not rule Elantir, no one would. After instructing his followers to crash into the flying city and bring it down, defeat its citizens' coils to the ritual, the resulting explosion altered the very face of the planet itself, causing plates to shift and water to fill and form a ruined sea at the epicenter of the blast. The residual power began corrupting and changing the inhabitants of the ruined land, forcing the elves to leave on ships in what became known as the Great Wander. The Day of Ashen Skies not only affected Elantir, but spread its devastation throughout the world, from volcanic eruptions in the Dame's Head Sea, which formed the Isle of Damesir that you see at the bottom of the sea, to a nearly 100-year-long presence of ash in the sky, leading to famine and death. Elves, just to clarify, are like you'd expect in most fantasy settings, magical and awe-inspiring. Only in Anbennar they are not immortal like in other ones, living for generally only about 300 to 400 years, but everything elven that you know is probably fairly true. As for the Exodus itself, or the Great Wander, they left on a fleet of ships known as the Remnant Fleet, whose numbers range in the telling from about 100 ships to 1,000, and ranged in size from fishing to large city-like ships known as migrant ships, of which there were a confirmed 8. This fleet would spend the next 1,000 years adrift, searching for a new home for the elven people. With the Day of Ashen Skies bringing terror to the wide world, many saw it as an omen of doom, and war broke out between the Demirian Republic and Castanor. In 5 AA, or after Ash, Castan the Paris forces were decimated, and the Emperor and his descendant fell, and 3 legions would fight at the base of the Trial Mount for who would be the next emperor. Castan the Paris' death is generally seen as the beginning of the late Castan Empire, which saw the empire frequently fragmented with brief resurgences of its former glory until its eventual dissolution in 1020 AA. In 470 AA, something known as the Dragon Wake began. After untold years of slumber, multiple dragons awoke and spread widespread destruction and terror. Castanor was fractured, the Demirian Republic collapsed, the Hellenic chieftain Godherja the Invader marched on the Castanorian citadel Balver Stek and forged the kingdom of Gwed, displacing many tribes in his wake, and an army of millions of kobolds rose up and destroyed the Gnomish hierarchy, leaving just one of the Antiquity empires standing, that being Castanor. This was followed by a warlord period in the former Demirian Lensinor, which you can see right here, between Gwedi invading warlords, Lensinor tribes, and Demirian remnants like the kingdoms of Treton and Carnatur, with the Gwedi controlling much of Lensinor until Lorenan the Great, chief of the Lensori Laurenti tribe, united his people and expulsed the Gwedi from the south. Lorenan would then go on to form the High Kingdom of Lensinor under his new united rule, becoming protector of the small country as well via the voluntary vassalage of their king, Tippin, which he ruled over peacefully for 60 years. In 657 AA, seeing the fractured and weakened position of the Castan Empire, King of Blades Elicast VI, ruler of the Blade Marches, which is a kingdom formerly situated south of Castanor, marched against Castanor, hoping to annex their heartland region of Ascan and the Castanorian city of Castanoth for themselves. But the Blade Marches were defeated, and their ancestral elven-forged blade Calendal was lost atop the Trial Mount following the King of Blades' failed attempt at becoming the next Castan. With the loss of their ancestral blade king and the war, the Blade Marches were reduced to a vassal state known as the Marches, and would remain a footnote for the next few centuries. In the southeast of Canor, situated in the deep woods in 670 AA, a corporate king known as Daravan, under constant and terrible assault from Nolish forces of the Third Zaz, became infamous for his plan to stop the invasions once and for all. During a battle to defeat the Zaz, Daravan, now known as the Malignant, conjured a dark ritual that flooded the entire southern coast of Coruvia, which is near Ascan, killing not only the Nolish forces, but his and those of Castanor's, to include Emperor Castan V, also known as the Steward. The land became utter ruin, with an inhospitable swamp known as Daravan's Folly rising in its wake. To this day, fiends are said to rise from its mists. From 798 to 978 AA, a people known as the Garudians begin to raid in groups known as Reavers, and begin settling in Canor in what is known as the Era of Black Ice. Though they would conquer and form a few kingdoms, their most notable accomplishment happened in 865 AA, when a Reaver named Gunnar Ebenfrost slew the Emperor of Castanor, ascended and conquered the Trials of Castan, and became the 49th Emperor of Castanor, claiming the title Castan Ebenfrost. His rule would mark a period of expansion for the empire, rivaled only by that of Castan the Great himself, into ancient Hellenic lands, and also saw the Trials of Castan permanently changed, and that only members of the Ebenfrost dynasty could participate and ascend to the throne of Castanor. This iteration of the empire would also become known as Black Castanor, a name that would soon bear a dreadful reputation in the coming age of Ascendancy. Other remarkable Reaver kingdoms would be Duran and the Reaver kingdoms along the Divenhall Sea, which you can see on the southwestern part of the map. And thus we've reached the end of the relatively short Age of Ashes. Next comes the Age of Ascendancy, which is our modern age, and the coming of the elves. Though we are rapidly approaching game start, this next section is an interwoven tableau of important events, the first of which is collectively known as the War of the Sorcerer King, which occurred between 978 and 1020 AA. It was chiefly fought between Black Castanor and the League of Free Realms, with the period of 978 to year 1000 being easily described as the rise of Black Castanor, and went something like this. In 978, Castanor, led by Castan the 52nd and his powerful sorcerer advisor Nikmer, began invading and conquering the nearby kingdom of Wexenard, which fell the following year. Following the destruction of Wexenard, the other free kingdoms in Canor united and formed the League of Free Realms, although this name would not be made official until much later. They did this in order to defend against the growing Black Castanor threat. In 980, the city-state of Vertesk invited Black Castanor to invade and free them of their Gwedi rulers. Black Castanor, not settling for just Vertesk, turned their gaze on Gwed as a whole and conquered them, giving their lands to the only major ally and puppet state they had throughout the war, the newly formed Vertesk Dominion in 986 AA. Around the same time as Gwed is besieged by Black Castanor, the kingdom of Laurent invades the small kingdom in hopes of annexing it. From 988 to 996 AA, the Eastern Dameshead is invaded, and the united forces of the League of Free Realms are pushed to the brink. From 992 AA to the year 1000, Castanor invaded Lensinor under Malfalda the Mad, an acolyte of Nikmer and master strategist whose grand design failed only because of the arrival of a new ally for the League. The invasion of Lensinor ravaged the small country, with Laurent proper being invaded in late 999. Though its capital Laurenti was soon sieged, it was never conquered. At this point, the war and all of its efforts seemed incredibly bleak, as the League had basically been pushed back constantly and was always on the defensive, and by the year 1000, Castanor had conquered most of Canor and seemed poised for victory. And then came the Elves. In the year 1000, just following a great storm which destroyed half the remnant fleet, and after 1,000 years of wandering, the Elves were dying and without hope. Elven navigator Munus, later known as Munus Moonsinger, was shipwrecked with his brother Varalor for 7 days following the storm. They were found by the migrant ship Estatha, whose captain Istrelani, a war singer, aided him and his brother in returning to their own migrant ship, Lunatine. With his parents dead, Munus, desperate for guidance after such a devastating loss of the fleet, threw a prayer up to the night sky and sang to the moon high above for salvation. And the moon answered, singing a song of liberation back, parting the proverbial clouds and showing the fleet the way to Canor, where the Elves would land on Damesir and the Dameshead Sea. It is also important to remember that not all fleets went with Munus and co. as they arrive here in the Damesir. Having discovered from passing fishermen about the war on the mainland, the migrant ship Direnhria and its fleet led by Jahir decided to stop in Venal, an island in southwestern Canor, to resupply and take stock of the devastation of the Great Storm caused to the Sundancer fleet. Though Jahir initially said he would reunite with the other fleets, he instead decided to sail further east towards Bulwar, where he would found his glorious kingdom in 1001 AA following the Sunrise War, where he and his forces liberated Sarhal from invading gnolls. This liberation would lead to an almost immediate veneration and worship of the newly crowned Bulwar ruler Jahir, the Sun King. But since a lot of his glory happens post-start time, you can think of Jahir as a sort of elven Alexander the Great, minus the dying really young part, unless that happens for you. He is said to be charismatic, beautiful, a formidable warrior, and wields a magical spear of precursor age metal, which glows yellow when struck, named Dina Toldir. It is worth noting that while Jahir did leave to form his own empire, he and his forces will participate heavily in the War of the Sorcerer King to come. Now back to Munus. As he and the rest of the fleet neared Damesir, they saw that upon the shore stood a single woman who, when Munus landed and approached, told him she was Ausi, Queen of Demeria and avatar of the Dame, the goddess of the moon, who had aided the elves in their landing. Though it was a frigid winter and supplies were thin thanks in part to the devastation of Black Castanor's march, the starving elves were welcomed to the queen's hearth and nursed back to life. It was here that Ausi explained to Munus and the rest of the elves the devastation of Black Castanor and that she and her warriors were soon to depart for Laurent to aid in its liberation. But Munus refused to let her kindness go unreturned, and using his skills of oration and charisma, rallied many of his own people to the Demirian cause, and thus the Elven Silver Band, a contingent of warriors led by Munus Moonsinger, was formed. Munus throughout the war would prove a capable commander despite his lack of martial prowess, thanks largely to his diplomatic skills. But before the band parted for the mainland in an act that was controversial amongst the elves and men, Munus and Ausi married atop Moonmount as a sign of love and union between elves and men forever. And though some, such as Munus's brother, welcomed this union, others did not wish to participate in a war they did not start. Thus, under the leadership of Maldorian the Navigator, the migrant ship and fleet of Galshea traveled north, where they would found Kelmaldor in northwestern Canor. The children of the union between Munus and Ausi would become the first half-elves, which is important because they're going to be everywhere very soon. The division of the elves, as you can see their migrant ships going different places, happened along distinct lines, which resulted in those of Munus being referred to as Moon Elves, who are the largest variant, Jahir's as Sun Elves, and those who refused to land and settled at sea as Sea Elves. With the key aid of the elves, the League of Free Realms won the Battle of Laurenti, renamed Laurentane after the battle was over, which saved Laurent and pushed the Castanorian forces out of Lensinor at the Second Battle of Ruby Pass. For the next 12 years, the League would begin liberating large swaths of Canor. Now, before we go on with the rest of the war, you may be wondering how longtime allies of Castanor, the dwarves, felt about this war. Well, to put simply, they felt pretty mixed about it, and both surface and stone dwarves in the region felt the coming of the elves was both a positive and negative thing. Positive because it helped balance the expansion of Castanor, but negative because many positions of dwarven importance in the continent were being replaced with elven ones, particularly in Lensinor. Some felt that Black Castanorians were misunderstood, and that their expanse was a natural result of their power, while others felt it was a gross overstep. Essentially, the dwarves were, as they often can be, non-committal, and also upset that they were being overshadowed, and decided to sulk about it for basically a few hundred years. As for the copper dwarves to the south, they had Jahir to contend with, and he all but banished them from his lands due to their cruel greed and insane debts they'd hold over people in the area, so they definitely didn't care for the elves at all. In 1013 AA, after over a decade of elven-backed fighting, the League of Free Realms successfully repelled a naval invasion from Vertesk at the Battle of Dame's Teeth. But Munus Moonsinger was tragically slain by an acolyte of the sorcerer Nikmer, Venak the Arrogant, who sent a terrible magic to Munus's ship, which exploded and sank into the Dame's head. Munus's death marked the end of the Silver Band, but not of elven aid in the war. His body, tragically, was never recovered. The following year, heroes of the Free Realms stormed the Black Tower of Vertesk, capturing it and the city, Munis is also avenged, and Venak the Arrogant is slain by Malgun the Unicorn Knight, a Laurentish war hero. In 1015, Castan the 52nd, now known as Castan the Enthralled, is struck on the head during battle, freeing him from Nikmer's bewitchment. Understanding the treachery of his advisor, the Castan demands an immediate end to the war, but Nikmer, realizing the spell was broken, slays the Castan, declaring himself the Sorcerer King of Black Castanor, and using his powers to enthrall his and Vertesk's former forces. Castanorian generals Kaelin Longlance, who previously defeated the Free Realms forces at the Battle of Morbin Flats, and Jakob the Betrayer break away from Nikmer to join the Free Realms as the Free Castanor Resistance. Their assistance aids the Free Realms in the liberation of Castanor from 1016 to 1019, which culminated in the surrender of Castaneth by the city patricians, in which the Free Castanorians were welcomed into the city with open arms. With his forces largely defeated, the Sorcerer King flees to the top of the Trial Mount, where he would remain for the next year. In the summer of 1020, a tournament was held for 2 weeks at the base of the Trial Mount, known as the Tourney of Grand Victory, to decide who would scale the Trial Mount and battle with the Sorcerer King. By the end of the tournament, a total of 18 individuals were selected to form the Trial Mount Company, a collection of the greatest heroes of their time who would scale the mountain and slay the Sorcerer King. It is worth noting that this is the first time in history that those who did not seek the throne of Castanor were going to scale the mountain. Of the 18 members who were going to scale the mountain, 3 would depart before the battle. Otrax of Wexenard, who was a massive warrior known for his strength, whose departure reason is unknown, although I suspect it's for a coming reason. Marion Silmuna, son of Munis and Ausi, and in-game king of Demiria, who returned to Demiria following the death of his mother to take the throne, and Marion's cousin Krieg, who was technically not part of the original group, but ascended the mountain to inform Marion of his mother's passing and escort him back to his homeland. I personally think that Otrak probably also assisted Marion going home, and that's why he left, but no, I can't confirm that. Now, out of the 15 who fought the Sorcerer King, only 6 actually survived. They were Clarimond of Oldhaven, Kaelin Longlance's squire, who delivered the final blow and slew the Sorcerer King using the fabled blade Calendal, which she found atop the Trial Mount, and claimed to become queen of the resurgent blade marches. Finnick Shadowhand Sylvie, master of Shadow and king of the small country. Garion the Wise, the first archmage and most powerful mage in Canor. Jahir, Sun Elven leader and ruler of the Phoenix Empire. Australania Warsinger, legendary elvish hero, who, if you remember, also rescued Munis Moonsinger after he and his brother were shipwrecked, and Melba the Mirror, one of the twin gnomish masters of illusion. As a result of the battle, the Trial Mount was all but destroyed, with most of its contests completely obliterated, forever invalidating the trials of Castan as a means of succession. The following year, on the anniversary of Nikmer's death, the Treaty of Anbecost was signed in Anbecost, the new Demirian capital city where the elves landed 21 years prior, splitting the former Castanorian lands into several kingdoms and granting the elves their own respective lands in Hellenic and Escani lands. A grand ball is held in Anbecost, marriages are accorded, new borders settled, and many of the noble half-elves who had come to populate Canor are conceived. The following year, a new pantheonic council is held, and Munis Moonsinger is deified as the god of sailors, travelers, and performers, the only elf to receive this honor. Elves began populating wide stretches of Canor, with many humans taking elves for wives or husbands, filling the nobility and common folk alike, in some cases with elven and therefore magical blood. This has an impact on Anbennar's world later, but in our setting this is just a fledgling thing, so there are very few half-elves wandering around. This brings us to 1022, or the game's start date. With the War of the Sorcerer King only a couple years past, there is much healing and redressing going on around Canor and beyond. While some like Jahir are poised to expand their empire to the south, others like Queen Clarimond to the north and the other fractured Castanorian kingdoms look to rebuild what was broken. It'll be up to you, the player, to decide the fate of the world from here, but remember, trouble brews on the horizon, and not all acolytes of the Sorcerer King have been put to rest. Will you rise to the challenge, or will you, as so many others have before you, fade with the shifting sands? And that's going to be it for me. I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time and watching this. I know it's not a short video. I'm glad, or I hope that you enjoy it. I hope it's something that you're interested in, and I hope that it gets you interested in this world and in this mod, and it gets more people to participate. That's kind of what I wanted to do here. But that's going to be it for me. So I'm Soul. Thank you so much for watching once again. This has been Anbennar, and I will happily see you in the next one.